Hey, my relatives. This is Mark Charles. I hope you are doing well. It is Friday, October 8th, and I'm sitting down continuing to drink my second cup of coffee. I've actually been nursing it for a little while here, and there's some things I wanted to share with you today. But before I begin, as I always do, I want to acknowledge that I'm from what's now known as Washington, D.C., and that these are the lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor and acknowledge the Piscataway as the host people of these lands, and I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. So there's a few things I wanted to jump on and talk about this morning. First of all, as you know, it is Indigenous Peoples Day coming up on Monday, and I had been scheduled to do an event in Albuquerque. I was going to be speaking at an event regarding white nationalism and the conservative right. And that event got delayed or postponed until November. And so it's moving to an entirely virtual event now instead of being in person. And it will be happening in November. And they're still finalizing the schedule, but I believe I will be speaking on Tuesday, November 16th. And as that gets nailed down more fully, I will share the details about that on my social media and let you know how you can attend that. And they were going to have a full day of webinars or of seminars on next week, Wednesday, which is what I was going to fly to Albuquerque for. And now they've decided to break it out into 3 virtual webinars throughout the month of November. And so you'll be able to purchase tickets either for all 3 as a package, or you can purchase them individually and attend just one or two of the webinars. And so I'll share out that information once it becomes available to me, but it should be around either early next week is my hope. Second, I will be speaking this weekend at an event, or not this weekend, on Indigenous Peoples Day. I'll be speaking at an event online, and it's for Great Spirit Church in Portland, Oregon. And they are part of a group of organizations that are doing pretty much a day-long virtual event for Indigenous Peoples Day. And I'm going to be speaking at that. And I want to bring that up here. Let me search it real quick. I forgot to get the link. It is... it's Great Spirit American United Methodist, Native American United Methodist Church. And I will give you a link for the event that I will be speaking at that you can share. So I'll put that into the chat right now. I am scheduled to speak sometime around maybe 11:30, I think, Pacific time. And that will be, well, the link didn't go in there for some reason. All right, let me get this here. I apologize for this. I forgot to get this link before I started. Normally I like to have these links ready that we can post. So there's a Facebook page where they have a flyer about the event. It's going to be running all day, and I'm speaking around noon, 11:30 or 12, I think, Pacific time, which will be about 2:30 or 3 o'clock here Eastern time. And I'll be speaking for about 30 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes regarding Indigenous Peoples Day and the honoring of that day. And probably we'll be touching on other issues important to Indian country, including the doctrine of discovery. But if you're available, that event will be free. It'll be live streaming on Facebook as well as a few other social media platforms. I think Instagram, but I don't have all those links yet. So follow me on social media, and I'll make sure that I have those links out there to people prior to that event. Another thing I wanted to talk about just briefly is today was a fairly big day. If you follow me on social media, you'll notice that I shared an article regarding Secretary of State Deb Haaland, who recommended to the Biden administration the restoration of the lands at Bears Ears in Utah. And Joe Biden took that recommendation and signed a bill, I don't know what he signed, but he signed something restoring Bears Ears if you remember, President Trump greatly diminished those lands that were set aside, much to the dismay of many Native peoples and Native nations. And so Deb Haaland visited those lands. I think it was one of her first visits after becoming Secretary of State, Secretary of the Interior. And she recommended to President Biden that he do restore those lands, and he did that. So I'm sharing two articles. One is published on Native News Online, and the second was published in Indian Country Today. And it just gives you a good perspective on those stories. So that's good news. And I've been following Deb Haaland's Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland's Twitter account, and I actually really appreciate the information she puts out there and the work that she's doing to bring a lot of these things to light and to really get our nation to focus on these issues. So, Secretary Haaland, thank you for your work, and I am very grateful for your recommendation and that those lands are being restored even as we speak. The thing I want to talk about more today is regarding Monday. As you know, Monday is Indigenous Peoples Day. It's also Columbus Day. And our nation will be celebrating both. There will be many events around the nation celebrating and honoring Native Americans and the indigenous hosts of these lands. And there will be events taking place in most major cities and in most states all around the country. And that's good news. That is a very good thing to do. The second is that we also will be celebrating Columbus Day, which is still the national holiday, which it is on Monday. And obviously there will still be people celebrating this very troubling holiday regarding Christopher Columbus and his discovery of America, right? If you read the first sentence of the first chapter of my book, it says that you cannot discover lands that are already inhabited. You can steal those lands, you can conquer those lands, you can colonize those lands, but you cannot discover them unless your worldview informs you that the people who are living there are not fully human. And so I just put a link into the comments where if you'd like to purchase a signed copy of that book, you can do so. But obviously Columbus Day, for many reasons, not only for the false narrative that he discovered these lands, but really for his being armed with the doctrine of discovery and using that discovery and co-opting the notion of promised lands to literally commit genocide and ethnic cleansing of Turtle Island. And so it is outrageous that our nation not only commemorates and celebrates this as a national holiday, but that we continue to do so even in 2021. And so this morning on my Twitter feed, I saw that the White House had issued an Indigenous Peoples Day Proclamation. The White House normally issues these proclamations a day or two before the actual day, and they get it out through their press secretary and their website. And so I noted it this morning when I was on a phone call, and I thought I'll have to go back and read that later. So I went back and I read the proclamation issued by President Biden. And then, kind of cringing, I thought, I wonder if he issued a Columbus Day proclamation as well. And so I went back to the briefing room website on the White House webpage, and sure enough, he did issue a Columbus Day proclamation as well. And I read that kind of very unsure of what I was going to find within the words of that proclamation. I will tell you, I was pleasantly surprised by some of the things he chose to talk about in that second proclamation, as well as the fact that I was a little bit troubled by some of the language he used in the first proclamation. And so I want to actually share both of these proclamations today with you in anticipation of Indigenous Peoples Day and Columbus Day, which is coming up on Monday. And I will put both of them into the chat or into the comment section, and then I will read them as well. I actually want to take some time to read them. I'm going to share my screen so that you can follow along with me in the text if you would like. But I wanted to get both of these proclamations out for you to look at. So the first, obviously, is, let's read the Indigenous Peoples Day Proclamation. And let me bring that up on the screen right now. And there we go. And I just want to read through this, and you can read along with me, and then I'll read the second proclamation, and we'll have a discussion about them. A proclamation on Indigenous Peoples Day 2021. Since time immemorial, American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians have built vibrant and diverse cultures, safeguarding land, language, spirit, knowledge, and tradition across generations. On Indigenous Peoples Day, our nation celebrates the invaluable contributions and resilience of Indigenous peoples, recognizes their inherent sovereignty, and commits to honoring the federal government's trust and treaty obligations to tribal nations. Our country was conceived on a promise of equality and opportunity for all people. A promise that despite the extraordinary progress we have made through the years, we have never fully lived up to. That is especially true when it comes to upholding the rights and dignity of the Indigenous people who were here long before colonization of the Americas began. For generations, federal policies systemically sought to assimilate and displace Native people and eradicate Native cultures. Today, we recognize Indigenous peoples' resilience and strength, as well as the immeasurable positive impact that they have made on every aspect of American society. We also recommit to supporting a new, brighter future of promise and equity for tribal nations, a future grounded in tribal sovereignty and respect for the human rights of Indigenous people in the Americas and around the world. In the first week of my administration, I issued a memorandum reaffirming our nation's solemn trust and treaty obligations to American Indians and Alaska Native tribal nations, and directed the heads of executive departments and agencies to engage in regular, meaningful, and robust consultation with tribal officials. It is a priority of my administration to make respect for tribal sovereignty and self-governance the cornerstone of federal Indian policy. History demonstrates that Native American people and our nation as a whole are best served when tribal governments are empowered to lead their communities and when federal officials listen to and work together with tribal leaders when formulating federal policy that affects tribal nations. The contributions that Indigenous people have made throughout history in public service, entrepreneurship, scholarship, the arts, and countless other fields are integral to our nation, our culture, and our society. Indigenous peoples have served and continue to serve in the United States Armed Forces with distinction and honor at one of the highest rates of any group, defending our security every day. And Native Americans have been on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic, working essential jobs and carrying us through our gravest moments. Further, in recognition that the pandemic has harmed Indigenous peoples at an alarming and disproportionate rate, Native communities have led the way in connecting people with vaccination, boasting one of the highest rates of any racial or ethnic group. The federal government has a solemn obligation to lift up and invest in the future of Indigenous people and empower tribal nations to govern their own communities and to make their own decisions. We must never forget the centuries-long campaign of violence, displacement, assimilation, and terror wrought upon Native communities and tribal nations throughout our country. Today, we acknowledge the significant sacrifices made by Native peoples to this country and recognize their many ongoing contributions to our nation. On Indigenous Peoples Day, we honor America's first inhabitants and the tribal nations that continue to thrive today. I encourage everyone to celebrate and recognize the many Indigenous communities and cultures that make up our great country. Now, therefore, I, Joseph R. Biden Jr., President of the United States of America, do hereby proclaim October 11, 2021 as Indigenous Peoples Day. I call upon the people of the United States to observe this day with appropriate ceremonies and activities. I also direct that the flag of the United States be displayed on all public buildings on the appointed day in honor of our diverse history and the Indigenous peoples who contribute to shaping this nation. In witness whereof, I have hereunto set my hand this 8th day of October in the year of our Lord 2021, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 246th. Joseph R. Biden Jr. Next, I want to read, that was the proclamation on Indigenous Peoples Day made by President Biden. Next, I want to read a proclamation on Columbus Day 2021. More than 500 years ago, after securing the support of Queen Isabella I and King Ferdinand II, Christopher Columbus launched the Nina and the Patina and the Santa Maria from the coast of Spain in 1492. While he intended to end his quest in Asia, his 10-week journey instead landed him on the shores of the Bahamas, making Columbus the first of many Italian explorers to arrive in what would later be known as the Americas. Many Italians would follow his path in the centuries to come, risking poverty, starvation, and death in pursuit of a better life. Today, millions of Italian Americans continue to enrich our country's tradition and culture and make lasting contributions to our nation. They are educators, healthcare workers, scientists, first responders, military service members, and public servants, among so many other vital roles. Today, we also acknowledge the painful history of wrongs and atrocities that many European explorers inflicted on tribal nations and indigenous communities. It is a measure of our greatness as a nation that we do not seek to bury these shameful episodes of our past, that we face them honestly, we bring them to light, we do all we can to address them. For Native Americans, Western exploration ushered in a wave of devastation, violence perpetrated against Native communities, displacement and theft of tribal homelands, the introduction and spread of disease, and more. On this day, we recognize this painful past and recommit ourselves to investing in Native communities, upholding our solemn and sacred communities to tribal sovereignty, and pursuing a brighter future centered on dignity, respect, justice, and opportunity for all people. In commemoration of Christopher Columbus' historic voyage 529 years ago, the Congress, by joint resolution of April 30, 1934, and modified in 1968, 36 U.S.C. 107, as amended, has requested the President proclaim the second Monday of October of each year as Columbus Day. Today, let this day be one of reflection on America's spirit of exploration, on the courage and contribution of Italian Americans throughout the generations, on the dignity and resilience of tribal nations and indigenous communities, and on the work that remains ahead of us to fulfill the promise of our nation for all. Now, therefore, I, Joseph R. Biden, United States of America, do hereby proclaim August 11, 2021 as Columbus Day. I declare that the flag of the United States be displayed on all public buildings on the appointed day in honor of our diverse history and all who have contributed to shaping this nation. In witness whereof, I have hereunto set my hand this 8th day of October in the year of our Lord 2021, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 246th. Joseph R. Biden Jr. Those are the two proclamations. I read the first one first this morning, the proclamation on the Indigenous Peoples Day. And I appreciated what Joe Biden said in that proclamation, not only of recognizing the people and the cultures and the contributions, but of also acknowledging the painful and violent and unjust and oppressive, and even, he didn't say genocidal, it was a genocidal past. But I appreciate that he acknowledged the missteps, the bad history of our nation, at least to some extent. I was a little discouraged as I read through that, both this morning and again now, how he weaves the myth of American exceptionalism throughout the Proclamation. He talks about tribal sovereignty, and again, that's a great language or word to use. In our nation, tribes do not have sovereignty. I often tell people we are sovereign over our lands the same way your teenage child is sovereign over their bedroom. And Joe Biden likes to believe that he can change those things merely by stating them as different, right? He loves to misquote the Declaration of Independence and says, "We hold the truth to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal." Again, that sounds beautiful, Mr. President. That's not what it says. And until we change what it says and actually adjust our laws and our foundations, it's not enough just to misquote it. And so while he talks about tribal sovereignty, right, we have literally Supreme Court case precedents stating Native nations are not sovereign over their lands. We have the 2005 Supreme Court case, Oneida Indian Nation versus the City of Sherrill, New York, where Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg references the doctrine of discovery and states that Native nations cannot rekindle the embers of sovereignty that have long ago grown cold. We have the Supreme Court case in 2020 in Oklahoma regarding the lands. I forget the exact title of that case, the one that declared that for judicial purposes, most of the state of Oklahoma was actually reservation lands. But that same opinion literally stated that any time the U.S. Congress desires to do so, it can break treaty with Native peoples and Native nations, and nobody will hold them accountable. And so while Joe Biden talks about sovereignty, the foundations of the nation do not reflect that, and actually state and declare that as president and as Congress, this nation has the right to break those treaties and to not acknowledge that sovereignty anytime they desire, and there will be no consequence for it. So I appreciate the language, but it does not address the constitutional as well as the judicial reality. So we have to acknowledge that. I appreciate that he gave his executives and the leaders of his departments charge to go out and speak and get consultation with Native peoples. I appreciate that he acknowledged the service of Native peoples as well as the disparity in effects given to us by Native as Indigenous peoples by COVID-19. And so there's many things I appreciated about what he said and the way he was direct. I was troubled by the way he wove American exceptionalism throughout the entire document, including, and there was one other quote I wanted to give you in this, where he talks about, this is towards the beginning, our country was conceived on a promise of equality and opportunity for all people. Now, that's just flat out false. That is not true whatsoever. If you read our Constitution, if you read our Declaration of Independence, if you know the doctrine of discovery, this nation was created and established for the benefit of a single demographic, white landowning men. It states that in the Declaration of Independence. It states that in the Constitution. We have laws today that still reinforce and reaffirm that reality. So it's not true. Our country was not conceived on a promise of equality and opportunity for all people. It wasn't. It was conceived on a promise of equality and opportunity for all white landowning men. And we have to address those things at that level. So it was a mixed bag. I appreciated some of his directness. I was troubled by, again, his continuing to reference the myth of American exceptionalism. Regarding the proclamation on Columbus Day, this is where I actually was kind of scared to read the proclamation, right? Because our nation it continues to celebrate this holiday, which directly resulted in the genocide and ethnic cleansing of Native peoples. And just like Germany would not celebrate the day that Hitler had his understanding of the final solution, right? Our nation should not celebrate a day that literally led to the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Native peoples. So I was hesitant to read this proclamation. Joe Biden seemed to try to address that in this proclamation by focusing his commemoration on Italian Americans and on their contribution to our nation. And I especially appreciated his third paragraph, where he very directly acknowledged that this day is extremely troublesome and even painful for our nation because of what the result was for Native peoples throughout our land. And I appreciated that he took a large section of this proclamation to address that, and even use some stronger language than he used in his Indigenous Peoples Day proclamation. He said, for Native Americans, Western exploration ushered in a wave of devastation, violence perpetrating against Native communities, displacement and theft of tribal lands, the introduction and spread of disease, and more. So I appreciated that. And then I think there was one other word where he went even more deep into that. I forget. I thought he used another term. Anyway, so I appreciate that he addressed that a bit more directly. Again, I was troubled by the fact that the way while he acknowledged, he said, today we acknowledge the painful history of wrongs and atrocities that many European explorers inflicted on tribal nations and indigenous communities. He went on, again, immediately, and this is where we see so clearly the trauma of white America, right? Because you can't say that without white people just freaking out. And so he immediately has to follow it up with the myth of American exceptionalism and says, it is a measure of our greatness. It is a measure of our greatness that as a nation, we do not seek to bury these shameful episodes of our past. That we face them honestly. We bring them to the light and we do all we can to address them. Mr. President, that is bullshit. There's no other way to say it, right? That is just so completely false. We do not face them honestly. We do not bring them to light. And we do not do all we can to address them. We don't. We do everything we can to bury these things, including President Biden, right? There were 2 forums for Native communities during this last presidential election. He didn't attend either. He did not go and speak publicly and directly amongst those who he was campaigning against to address Native communities. He has never addressed the doctrine of discovery. He has not called the history genocidal. But again, this is what the trauma of white America is, right? You can't acknowledge that first sentence was strong. Today, we also acknowledge the painful history of wrongs and atrocities that many European explorers inflicted on tribal nations. And now, again, he blames it on the explorers and not on this nation as a whole. But then, just to make sure he doesn't lose his white landowning base, which is the white landowning male base, which is the base that got him elected, he said, it is a measure of our greatness as a nation that we do not seek to bury these shame. Our nation is working so hard to bury these things. So anyway, I appreciated his directness. I, again, was deeply troubled by his consistent appeal to the myth of American exceptionalism. I think these two proclamations may have been two of the better proclamations I've ever heard coming from our country, possibly even better than President Obama's, because, again, his were also littered with myths of American exceptionalism. And I don't recall his being as direct about the violence and atrocities as this one was. But this is still a very, very long way off from what we need to do. Right? Even the fact that our nation is holding these two holidays together, that as president, you have to give a proclamation on Indigenous Peoples Day and a proclamation on Columbus Day on the very same day. Right? This is just how disillusioned we are, how uninformed we are about our own history. So anyway, I will definitely be putting some more thought into these proclamations and talking about them. There's many things I appreciate about what President Biden is doing. I hate to say it this way, but for a white man, he's trying. And he's doing better than most of the other white men who were elected before him. But you have to understand how ridiculously low the bar is for white landowning males in this country to be affirmed for their actions. Ridiculously low. And so while he's doing better than the many, many, many other white landowning male presidents before him, that doesn't say much, because that bar is so incredibly low. So we need to do better, my relatives. We need to do better. We need to elect better leaders. We need to deal more with the foundations. We need to not just state these niceties, but we need to address them in our foundations so that it doesn't become just the whim of whoever happens to be in office. But we actually have laws and constitutional values that state we believe and will hold ourselves to a different standard. Every year that we do not make these changes to our foundations, what it means, no matter how nice and how beautiful these words may sound coming from these people, by not addressing it at the foundation, what it means is they want to say these things but not be held accountable for them. Because when you change the foundations, there now is a basis to hold you accountable. Simply misquoting the documents, you will not be held accountable for that. So this is why we need foundational level change. And this is why, as good as these were comparatively, right? We always tend to grade white people on a curve, a massive curve. They're nowhere near nowhere near where we need to be. And that's what we need to talk about this Indigenous Peoples Day. That's what we have to address. We cannot just allow it to be enough that we now have a Native American Secretary of the Interior, or that we have other people in state and even federal offices around the country, or not that we actually have an Indigenous Peoples Day. We can't just be satisfied with that type of window dressing. We have to continue to push for the foundational level changes. Because until we get those changes, there's no way to hold anyone accountable. It's merely what they want, what their desire is. There's nothing that states they have to actually treat us as equal and treat Native peoples and Native nations as sovereign. The Supreme Court verified that just last year. So that's why I'm continuing to press the dialogue regarding our foundations. I hope this is helpful, my relatives. It's good to talk with you. I'm very grateful to have a chance to share some of these thoughts with you. And I'm looking forward to talking more about these things in the event I'll be speaking at on Monday regarding Indigenous Peoples Day through the Great Spirit and the other organizations in Portland. And I'll share those links out on my social media later over the weekend. Anyway, my relatives, I thank you for joining me for my now lukewarm second cup of coffee. And I look forward to the dialogue we're going to have moving forward. My relatives, walk in beauty. And may we learn how to walk in beauty together. Hagonet.